They were hunted down as fanatics, ridiculed by the national press, and abandoned by their own families. In the heart of 19th century America, the early Adventists were seen not only as a new religious denomination, but as a real threat to the social order, dangerous lunatics who dared to challenge the establishment and announce that the end of the world had a set date. If you think their faith was just a different doctrine, you've been misled by superficial history. The real secret behind the visceral fear and scorn they faced was the fact that they dared to shake the structures of the American dream, prophesying the imminent collapse of a proud society and tearing away the masks of religious hypocrisy of the time. They confirmed what the world feared most, that time was running out and that the countdown to final judgment had already begun. Imagine the shock of an entire nation trying to build its earthly empire, hearing a group of farmers and students assert, Bible in hand, that it would all turn to ashes in a few months. The impact was immediate and devastating. People didn't hate them because they were wrong, but because their message demanded a radical choice that no one wanted to make. Imagine yourself today looking at the clock and knowing that everything you've built, every plan, every investment could disappear tomorrow. How would you react if someone knocked on your door with that absolute certainty? Leave a comment below if you would have the courage to give up everything for a conviction like that, or if you would think they were crazy. The truth is that the message of Christ's imminent return acted as an uncomfortable mirror for a generation that professed the Christian faith but lived entirely focused on the riches of this world. When William Miller began proclaiming that Jesus would return around 1844, he wasn't just preaching a sermon, he was lighting a fuse in a cultural powder keg. The reaction was an explosive mixture of panic and mockery. Traditional churches closed their doors to them. Newspapers published cruel caricatures depicting them in ascension robes, waiting on rooftops, and neighbors pointed fingers in the streets with a soul-burning contempt. They felt the weight of complete social isolation. Mockery was a weapon of defense for society. If they turned those believers into official jokes, they wouldn't have to face the terrifying possibility that they might be right. This was not a movement born in the comfort of luxurious temples, but in the heat of overcrowded tents, under the weight of agonizing tears and prayers that cried out to heaven in the middle of the night. They were misunderstood because they spoke a language that the materialistic world could no longer discern, the language of eternal urgency. Each step they took toward the prophetic date increased the boiling cauldron of hostility around them. They sold their land, abandoned their crops to rot in the fields, and closed their stores, not out of madness, but out of an intellectual and spiritual honesty rarely found today. This total surrender was seen as a public affront to common sense and the local economy. The tension in American cities was almost palpable. People watched this preparation with a mixture of morbid curiosity and a growing hatred that simmered on street corners. The Adventists knew they had crossed a line of no return, where reputation, money, and even personal safety were now worth absolutely nothing in the face of the magnitude of eternity knocking at their door. They were completely alone on the human stage, exposed to public ridicule, holding only the promise written on pages worn by constant handling. As the months of 1844 progressed, the atmosphere in America became increasingly charged and violent, transforming that expectation into a test of psychological and spiritual survival for every man, woman, and child who had decided to set foot on that narrow, irreversible road. The stage was set for the most dramatic moment in modern religious history, a breaking point where the silence of heaven would test the absolute limits of human sanity and the very existence of that persecuted group. The silence that followed the night of October 22nd, 1844, was the most painful and deafening sound that group of believers had ever heard. The date passed, the sun rose the next day, and the sky remained unchanged. What became known as the Great Disappointment was not just a religious frustration, it was an emotional catastrophe that shattered the identity of those men and women. Imagine the pain of looking into the eyes of their children who had spent the night awake waiting for heavenly glory and having to say that the world remained exactly the same, cold and hostile. The mockery that was once feared transformed into a relentless storm of public humiliation. They went out into the streets and were greeted with laughter. Neighbors knocked on their doors asking why they hadn't yet ascended to heaven, and many were driven from their own homes by enraged family members who considered them a disgrace to the family. The press reveled in cruel editorials, definitively branding the movement as one of the greatest intellectual and spiritual frauds in American history. The internal conflict was even worse than the external persecution, for they wondered in the depths of their souls if God had abandoned them or if it had all been nothing more than a collective delusion. Most succumbed to the pressure, abandoned their faith, begged forgiveness on their knees from their former churches, and tried to rebuild what remained of their shattered lives. But a small remnant refused to accept that this profound experience had been in vain. They could not deny the fire they had felt in their hearts and the clarity with which they had studied the scriptures. It was in this scorched earth scenario, where human dignity had been reduced to dust, that the true essence of Adventism began to be forged under incandescent heat. They gathered in hidden barns, with the doors locked for fear of violent mobs, weeping and leafing through the pages of the Bible at dawn, seeking an answer to the question that gnawed at their minds. Where did we go wrong? Can you imagine yourself in their place, upholding a truth that everyone around you spits on and laughs in your face? Write in the comments if you have ever had the experience of defending something you strongly believed in, even when the whole world said you were completely wrong. For the pioneers, the answer did not come through stubborn pride, but through a kneeling quest that demanded the sacrifice of their already shattered reputations. They began to understand that the error was not in the prophetic chronology, but in the event itself. The sanctuary to be cleansed was not the earth, but the heavenly sanctuary. This new understanding did not appease the critics. On the contrary, it further exacerbated the general misunderstanding. For 19th century America, which embraced prosperity theology and believed that the church should humanize the world through politics and material progress, the message of an investigative judgment occurring in the heavens seemed like unacceptable mystical madness. Adventists were once again seen as dangerous because instead of disappearing in the shame of error, they resurfaced with an even more structured, systematic, and challenging conviction. They were no longer just frightened peasants waiting for the end. They were becoming profound theologians, rescuing truths forgotten over the centuries and connecting complex prophecies with a logic that disarmed even the most intellectual critics. The leadership of young men like James White, the determination of Ellen White, and the erudition of pioneers like Joseph Bates transformed that fragmented group into an organized and resilient movement. The conflict escalated because they began to touch on deep dogmatic wounds of Christianity at the time, such as the immortality of the soul, and even more dramatically, the sanctity of the biblical Sabbath as opposed to the traditional Sunday. Adopting the Sabbath as the true day of rest in 19th century Puritan and industrialized America was the ultimate test of economic and social isolation. It meant closing businesses on the most profitable day of the week and working on the day when everyone else demanded rest and religious respect. Society saw them as social rebels, transgressors of public order, and fanatics who wanted to destroy the foundations of Western Christian civilization. Misunderstanding now mingled with legalistic distrust, and the authorities began to look at that group with watchful and stern eyes. The pressure increased with each step, but the backbone of that movement had already been tested in the fire of the deepest disappointment, making them immune to the fear of isolation or the pain of popular rejection. Each new doctrine they rediscovered in the scriptures served as a brick in the construction of an indestructible spiritual fortress, prepared to withstand the winds of human doctrines and the hatred of a world that categorically refused to awaken from its slumber of false security and spiritual complacency. The transformation of that group of survivors into a global movement did not happen through political force or financial resources, but through an inner metamorphosis that redefined the meaning of perseverance. They understood that preparing for Christ's return was not about marking dates on the calendar or isolating themselves on hills, but about manifesting God's character in the midst of a corrupt generation. The Adventist lifestyle, focused on health reform, holistic education, and temperance, was born not as a set of restrictive rules, but as a strategy of spiritual resistance. They understood that the body was the temple of the Holy Spirit, and that a clear mind was indispensable for discerning the profound truths of the Word in a world anesthetized by materialism. The people who had previously ridiculed them began to witness something disturbing. Those men and women who had been publicly humiliated now displayed unshakable peace, vibrant health, and an integrity that no amount of money could buy. Instead of shrinking from prejudice, they built hospitals, founded schools, and launched printing presses that spread pages of hope to every corner of the earth. The emotional climax of this historical journey is revealed when we realize that the greatest legacy of the early Adventists was not surviving the shame of misinterpretation, but discovering the beauty of God's grace amidst their own ruins. They taught us that true commitment to God requires the courage to be a misunderstood minority in order to stand on the side of eternal truth. Looking at their trajectory, we are confronted with a question that echoes deep in our own hearts. Would we have the same moral fiber to uphold our convictions when everything around us crumbled? Write in the comments if the story of these pioneers inspires you to seek a more authentic and courageous faith in your own daily life. The final answer they left for history was not an arrogant theological defense, but the silent and powerful testimony of lives completely transformed by God's love. They overcame fear, mockery, and isolation because their eyes were not fixed on the temporal rewards of this world, but on the heavenly homeland that Christ himself promised to prepare. Today, this story invites us to awaken from the sleep of spiritual indifference and make a real commitment to what truly matters for eternity. If this intense dive into the history of the early Adventists has touched your heart and challenged your perspective on faith, don't keep this message to yourself. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss future content. Activate the notification bell, like this video to support our work, and share it with all your friends and family who need inspiration to face life storms with renewed courage and hope.